What would you do if your fiance left you for your own sister? Most people expected me to cry, beg, or disappear quietly. Instead, I bought a custom Dior gown, embraced every curve they once mocked, and walked into their wedding on the arm of New York's most feared crime syndicate boss. Their reaction was worth every painful night I had survived. The trouble that followed was not planned, but Liam Carter had always been good at creating damage and blaming someone else. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, printed on thick cream cardstock with gold lettering. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Jenkins requested my presence at the marriage of their daughter Chloe Jenkins to Mr. Liam Carter. I read the names again and again until my hands went cold. Liam was the man who had placed a 2-carat Tiffany diamond on my finger 14 months earlier. He had promised me forever, then ended everything on a Manhattan rooftop with calm, practiced cruelty. Chloe, my younger sister, had always been the favorite. Perfect, praised, and protected. Now she was marrying the man who had once called me the love of his life, and they had invited me to watch. I thought we were celebrating his recent promotion. Instead, he handed me a glass of champagne and systematically dismantled my self-worth. "I need a wife who fits the corporate image, Hazel," he had said, his eyes avoiding my size 18 body. "You're a brilliant PR executive, but you've let yourself go. My partners go to the Hamptons. They go yakking in Monaco. You don't fit into that world anymore. And Chloe, well, she does." The revelation that he had been sleeping with my sister for 6 months came 3 days later, delivered not by Liam, but by my mother. We had been sitting in the dining room of my parents, Upper East Side brownstone. My mother had patted my hand, looking at me with a sickening mix of pity and exasperation. "Hayes will be the bigger person," she had sighed. "Chloe is younger, she's head over heels, and frankly, Liam needs someone who looks the part of a VP's wife. You have your career. Let your sister have this." They expected me to quietly disappear, to stay hidden in my apartment with a pint of Ben & Jerry's, fulfilling the exact fat girl stereotype they had boxed me into. That night, I didn't go home to cry. I put on my favorite black wrap dress, swiped on a layer of bold MAC Ruby Woo lipstick, and took a cab to the Baccarat Hotel. I needed to be surrounded by crystal, expensive bourbon and strangers who didn't know my humiliating reality. The bar was dimly lit, glittering with red chandeliers and the hushed murmurs of the 1%. I sat in a corner booth, nursing a $50 glass of Blandon's, letting the burning liquid numb the ache in my chest. "Excuse me, but you're taking up a lot of space." I blinked, pulling myself out of my misery. A man in a cheap, poorly tailored suit, likely a junior analyst, trying to play big shot, was sneering down at me. He held a martini in one hand, swaying slightly. "I need this booth for my clients. Why don't you waddle over to the bar, sweetheart? Or better yet, a gym?" My blood ran cold. The sheer audacity, combined with the raw bleeding wound of Liam's exact same criticisms, paralyzed me. I opened my mouth to bite back, but before a single syllable could escape my lips, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was low, growly, and laced with an unmistakable quiet violence. I looked up. The man standing behind the junior analyst looked like he had been carved out of shadow and marble. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders. His jawline was sharp, his dark hair flawlessly styled, but it was his eyes that stole the breath from my lungs. They were pitch black, utterly devoid of warmth, fixed on the drunken analyst, like a predator watching a wounded rabbit. I was just asking her to move," the drunk stammered, all his previous bravado evaporating instantly. "She was sitting here," the stranger said softly. "He didn't yell. He didn't have to, and you spoke to her with disrespect. Apologize." "Look, buddy, I don't know who you think." In a flash, so quick I barely registered it, the stranger's hand shot out. He gripped the back of the analyst's neck. The drunken man let out a sharp gasp of pain, his martini glass shattering on the floor. "I won't ask again," the dark-haired man whispered, leaning in. "Apologize to the lady, or you will find yourself learning how to breathe through a tube at Mount Si. Say you are sorry for speaking to a queen like a peasant." "I'm sorry. I'm sorry, God. I'm sorry," the man whimpered. The stranger released him with a look of utter disgust. He snapped his fingers and two massive men in dark suits materialized from the shadows of the bar. "Throw him out. Ensure he doesn't gain entry to any establishment in Manhattan for the rest of the year." As the men dragged the sobbing analyst away, the stranger turned his attention to me. The dangerous icy storm in his eyes vanished, replaced by a dark, intense curiosity. "May I sit?" he asked. I nodded dumbly. "Thank you. You didn't have to do that." "I despise bad manners," he said smoothly, signaling the bartender to bring another round. "And I despise it even more when a beautiful woman is made to feel less than she is. I'm Lorenzo." My heart did a strange flutter. "Hazel. Lorenzo Moretti." The name clicked in my brain a second later, sending a jolt of sheer terror down my spine. Anyone who read the Metro section of the New York Times knew that name. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was the undisputed head of the Moretti crime syndicate. He controlled the docks, half the real estate in the city, and was rumored to have politicians eating out of his palm. He was dangerous, lethal, and he was sitting across from me, looking at my curves with unapologetic hunger. "Why is a woman with your fire drinking alone and crying into top-shelf bourbon?" "Hazel," Lorenzo asked, his voice a hypnotic purr. The bourbon loosened my tongue. Before I knew it, the whole pathetic story came spilling out. Liam, my sister, the betrayal, the comments about my weight, the wedding invitation sitting on my kitchen counter. Lorenzo listened in utter silence. When I finished, I expected a look of pity. Instead, his jaw clenched, a muscle feathering angrily in his cheek. "This man," Lorenzo said softly, the lethal edge returning to his voice. "He discarded a masterpiece because he lacks the sophistication to appreciate it. He prefers a cheap sketch to a Renaissance painting." I let out a wet laugh. "Well, the cheap sketch is walking down the aisle at the Oha Castle in 5 days." Lorenzo leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He reached across the table, his thumb gently brushing a stray tear from my cheek. His touch sent a shockwave through my system. "Hazel," he murmured, "I have a proposition for you. You are going to this wedding, and you are going to show them exactly what a goddess looks like. But you won't go alone. I won't. No. You're going to walk into that castle on my arm, and I promise you by the end of the night your ex-fiancé will be begging for mercy, and your sister will be entirely forgotten." The next 5 days were a whirlwind of opulence that felt entirely detached from reality. Lorenzo Moretti didn't just make promises, he orchestrated them with terrifying precision. On Wednesday morning, a black armored Maybach pulled up to my apartment building. Lorenzo's right-hand man, a terrifyingly stoic brute named Matteo, handed me an embossed black envelope. Inside was a black card with my name on it, and a handwritten note from Lorenzo. "Buy the armor you need for the war." I didn't go to some off-Theric department store. I called in favors from my high-end PR clients. By Thursday, I was standing on a velvet pedestal in the private VIP suite of Christian's flagship boutique. Sriano himself, known for celebrating women of all sizes, designed a gown specifically for my measurements. It was a masterpiece, a deep, glittering, emerald green silk crepe gown that hugged every single curve of my size 18 body. It featured a plunging sweetheart neckline that celebrated my full bust, a corseted waist that snatched me in, and a high thigh slit that screamed unapologetic confidence. It wasn't a dress designed to hide my body. It was a weapon forged to showcase it. On Saturday, the day of the wedding, I sat at my vanity as a top-tier makeup artist and hairstylist, sent by Lorenzo, of course, worked their magic. My dark curls were pinned back into a cascading vintage Hollywood sweep. My lips were painted a deep, dangerous ruby, and my eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. When a knock came at my door, I took a deep breath, smoothing down the emerald silk. I opened the door. Lorenzo stood in the hallway looking like a dark god, stepping out of a Mafia film. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, a crisp white shirt, and a midnight green silk pocket square that perfectly matched my gown. For a long moment, the deadliest man in New York just stared at me. The ruthless, calculating coldness in his eyes completely dissolved, replaced by a fiery, undeniable lust. "Hazel," he breathed, stepping into the apartment. "You are breathtaking, a true Regina." He pulled a velvet box from his jacket pocket. "A queen needs her crown," he murmured. He opened it to reveal a breathtaking Harry Winston diamond and emerald necklace. Before I could protest the sheer cost of it, he stepped behind me, brushing my hair aside. His warm fingers grazed my bare neck as he clasped the heavy jewels around my throat. I shivered the weight of the diamonds grounding me in this surreal reality. "Ready to ruin a wedding," he whispered into my ear, his breath hot against my skin. "Let's burn it down," I whispered back. The drive to Long Island took an hour. O Castle loomed in the distance, a sprawling palatial estate meant to evoke European royalty. It was the exact pretentious, over-the-top venue Liam and Chloe had obsessed over. We arrived just as the cocktail hour was transitioning into the grand reception. The ceremony was over. I had deliberately skipped watching them say their vows to preserve my sanity. We were strictly there for the grand entrance. The valet rushed forward to open my door, but Lorenzo beat him to it. He offered me his hand, his grip firm and reassuring. As we walked up the grandstone steps toward the sprawling ballroom, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Lorenzo sensed it. He pulled me slightly closer, tucking my hand securely into the crook of his arm. "Head high, Hazel. You own this room. They are merely guests in your presence." The massive gold-leafed double doors of the grand ballroom were closed. Inside, I could hear a string quartet playing a lively Vivaldi piece, followed by the clinking of champagne flutes and the obnoxious booming laughter of my father. Lorenzo gestured to the two event coordinators standing by the doors. They took one look at Lorenzo's icy glare and scrambled to pull the heavy oak doors open. The music didn't stop immediately, but the conversation did. It started at the back of the room and washed over the 300 guests like a tidal wave of silence. I stepped into the light of the crystal chandeliers, the emerald silk of my dress shimmering with every step, the Harry Winston diamonds catching the light and blinding anyone who dared to look. I didn't slouch. I didn't try to shrink myself. I stood at my full height, my curves on magnificent, unapologetic display, and then the whispers began. Not about me, about the man on my arm. "Is that... Oh my God, it's Moretti. What is Lorenzo Moretti doing here?" I scanned the room and finally spotted the head table. Chloe was draped in a ridiculously frothy Oscar de la Renta gown that made her look like a skinny marshmallow. Her smug, bridal glow evaporated the second her eyes locked onto me. Her jaw physically dropped. Next to her sat Liam. He was mid-sip of his champagne. He froze, his eyes rad over my body, the same body he had called inadequate, the same curves he had sneered at, and a flush of deep, unmistakable regret painted his pale face. He looked from my plunging neckline to the diamonds, and finally up to the man holding my arm. The moment Liam recognized Lorenzo Moretti, the color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. As a VP in a major Wall Street firm, Liam knew exactly who controlled the shadows of New York's financial districts. Lorenzo led me gracefully down the center of the room, parting the sea of wealthy elites like Moses at the Red Sea. Politicians who had been laughing loudly suddenly ducked their heads, terrified to make eye contact with the mob boss. We stopped right in front of the head table. "Hazel," my mother hissed, standing up her face, a mask of panicked fury. "What is the meaning of this?" "You are interrupting." Lorenzo didn't even raise his voice. He simply shifted his gaze to my mother. The sheer homicidal blankness in his dark eyes made her snap her mouth shut so fast her teeth clicked. "We are here to offer our congratulations," Lorenzo said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the dead, silent ballroom. He looked directly at Liam, who looked like he was about to vomit. "Liam, is it? I hear you are a man who appreciates high-value investments." Liam swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Mr. Moretti, Yes, thank you for coming." Lorenzo pulled me a fraction closer, his hand resting possessively on the dip of my waist. "It is a shame," Lorenzo smiled, a terrifying baring of teeth. "You had a diamond, Liam, and you traded it for cubic zirconia. But I suppose a man of limited vision can only handle so much brilliance." Chloe let out a strangled, indignant gasp, her face turning beet red. "Excuse me, who do you think you are?" "Chloe, shut up," Liam hissed, grabbing her arm with trembling fingers. He looked back at Lorenzo, sheer panic in his eyes. "Mr. Moretti, please enjoy the reception." Lorenzo leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my bare shoulder, never breaking eye contact with my ex-fiancé. I could practically hear Liam's ego shattering into a million pathetic pieces. "Oh, we will," Lorenzo whispered. "But the night is young, and we are just getting started." The reception was a masterclass in psychological warfare, and Lorenzo Moretti was the undisputed general. We didn't just take any seats. We took the seats belonging to my Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan at table 1, right next to the newlyweds. Uncle Robert, a man who usually loved to loudly complain about his gout, took one look at the heavily tattooed Matteo looming behind Lorenzo's chair and wordlessly dragged his wife to a table near the kitchen doors. Dinner was served, and for the first time in over a year, I actually enjoyed my food in front of my family. For months, Liam had scrutinized every morsel that passed my lips. Now, I dug into the prime-filled minor and black truffle risotto with unapologetic joy. Beside me, Lorenzo watched me eat with a dark, fascinated approval, occasionally offering me a bite of his own lobster tail. Across the room, Chloe sat picking miserably at her undressed salad, her eyes darting nervously toward our table. Her Oscar de la Renta gown suddenly looked less like a fairy tale dress and more like a restrictive cage. Liam, meanwhile, was sweating through his bespoke tuxedo, downing glasses of Domingo like it was tap water. Halfway through the main course, I needed a moment to breathe. The heavy perfume of the floral centerpieces and the sheer adrenaline of the evening were making me lightheaded. I excused myself to the ladies' room, leaving Lorenzo deep in a hushed, intimidating conversation with a terrified state senator who had made the mistake of making eye contact. The hallway leading to the restrooms was lined with antique mirrors and heavy velvet drapery. I was touching up my Ruby Woo lipstick when the heavy oak door swung shut with a menacing click. I turned around. Liam was standing there, his face flushed, his bow tie undone. He looked cornered, desperate, and pathetic. "Hazel," he breathed, stepping toward me. "Liam," I said, my voice dripping with ice. "You're in the wrong bathroom, though I suppose boundaries were never your strong suit." "Don't do this," he pleaded, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked me up and down, and for the first time in our history, I saw genuine, greedy desire in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a fat girl he needed to fix. He was looking at a woman he realized he could never afford. "You look, God, Hazel, you look incredible. That dress? I didn't realize. You didn't realize a woman with curves could outshine your little pageant queen." I stepped forward, refusing to shrink. "Or you didn't realize that my worth wasn't dictated by your fragile corporate ego." "It was a mistake," Liam whispered, closing the distance between us. He actually reached out, trying to grab my hand. I snatched it back as if he had burned me. His desperation was palpable, spilling out in a pathetic litany of excuses. "Chloe means nothing to me." He practically spat the words out. "She was just easy, Hazel. She agreed with everything I said. But she's boring. She doesn't have your fire. The firm pressured me. My managing director made comments about our image. I panicked. I thought I needed a trophy wife to make partner. We can fix this. Leave that thug you came with. I'll annul the marriage tomorrow. We can go to Paris, just like we planned. I stared at him, a genuine laugh bubbling up from my chest. It was loud, rich, and echoed off the marble walls. You really think I'd take you back after you slept with my sister and told me my body was an embarrassment? Liam, you aren't a prize. You're a cautionary tale. His face darkened, the faux remorse vanishing, replaced by the cruel, arrogant VP. I knew too well. You think you're safe with Moretti? He's using you, Hazel. He's a monster. You think a guy like him actually wants a woman who looks like you? You're a prop. Before I could unleash the blistering comeback sitting on my tongue, the heavy oak door of the restroom was kicked open with such force the brass handle shattered against the marble wall. Lorenzo stood in the doorway. He didn't look angry. He looked lethal. Matteo stepped in silently behind him, locking the door and standing guard. I believe, Lorenzo said, his voice, a soft, terrifying rasp. I told you earlier about my distaste for bad manners. Liam backed up, hitting the sinks. Mr. Moretti, I was just. In a blur of motion, Lorenzo crossed the room. He didn't punch Liam. He didn't have to. He simply grabbed the lapels of Liam's tuxedo, hoisted him off the ground, and slammed him against the antique mirror. The glass cracked in a massive spiderweb pattern behind Liam's head. You speak to her with reverence, Lorenzo whispered, his face inches from Liam's terrified, sweating face. She is a queen. You are a roach scurrying in the dirt. If you ever disrespect her body, her mind, or her presence again, I will have you dismantled so thoroughly that dental records won't be enough to identify you. Nod, if you understand. Liam nodded frantically, tears of absolute terror spilling down his cheeks. Lorenzo dropped him in a crumpled heap on the floor, smoothing his own cuffs with terrifying calm. He turned to me, offering his arm. Shall we, Maya Bella? I believe it's time for the toasts, and I brought a wedding gift. The ballroom was thick with tension when we returned. The best man had just finished a stuttering, awkward speech, clearly rattled by the icy glare Lorenzo had directed at him from across the room. As the polite applause died down, Lorenzo didn't sit. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and gently tapped it with a silver fork. The ringing sound was delicate, yet it commanded the room instantly. The band stopped playing. 300 guests froze in their seats. A toast. Lorenzo announced, his voice carrying an effortless, dark authority. He slowly walked toward the dance floor, leading me with him. I kept my head held high, the emerald silk of my Sriano gown swishing around my legs. Chloe looked like she was about to faint. My mother was clutching her pearls, literally. Liam, who had just sneaked back into the room looking bruised and disheveled, stood frozen by his chair. Weddings are a time of truth. Lorenzo began pacing slowly, a merging of assets, a dehazel of loyalty. Liam, you spoke so highly of corporate image, of fitting into a specific world. But you see, in my world, we have a very strict policy on theft. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. What is he talking about? Chloe hissed at Liam, her voice shrill. Liam didn't answer. His face was entirely bloodless. Lorenzo signaled to Matteo, who pulled a sleek iPad from his jacket and tapped the screen. Suddenly, the massive projector screen that had been showing a cheesy slideshow of Chloe and Liam's romance flickered to life. Instead of photos from their Hamptons engagement, a highly detailed, devastating financial spreadsheet appeared on the screen, completely visible to the 300 wealthy elites in the room. Lorenzo turned to face the crowd, slipping one hand into his pocket. I am a businessman, and recently my forensic accountants uncovered some fascinating discrepancies in a series of offshore shell companies managed by Morgan Stanley, specifically by a young, ambitious vice president. A collective gasp, rippled through the room. Bankers, politicians, and socialites leaned in their eyes wide with shock. "Let's review the couple's registry, shall we?" Lorenzo asked, a cruel smile playing on his lips. To my absolute shock and delight, a beautifully formatted graphic flashed onto the screen, detailing exactly how my fiance had funded his opulent lifestyle. "You see," Lorenzo explained softly, turning his dark eyes to Liam, "when you stole $2 million to fund your yacht trips, your luxury condo, and this ridiculously tacky wedding, you didn't just steal from your clients. You stole from a holding company owned by my family." The silence in the room was absolute, deafening, and glorious. "You," Chloe shrieked, turning to Liam and slapping his chest. "You told me you had a trust fund. You told me you were rich." "Chloe, please," Liam begged, trying to grab her hands. "I did it for us, to give you the life you wanted. You did it because you are a weak, shallow man who needs shiny things to distract from his hollow soul," I said, my voice ringing out clear and strong. I looked at my sister, whose makeup was running down her face, and my mother, who was sobbing into a napkin. I felt no pity. I felt entirely, utterly free. "You deserve each other." Lorenzo smiled at me, a look of pure, burning adoration. He snapped his fingers. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open once more. Not event staff this time, but 6 men in tactical windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters FBI. Accompanying them were officers from the SEC. Lorenzo, it turned out, didn't just use violence. He used the law as a weapon when it suited him. Liam Carter, the lead agent, barked, flashing a badge. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny." Pandemonium erupted. Chloe screamed as agents pushed past the cake table. Liam tried to run, knocking over a tower of champagne glasses, but Matteo easily tripped him, sending the groom sprawling onto the marble floor, right at the feet of the federal agents. They hauled him up, slapping cold steel handcuffs over the wrists of his custom tuxedo. As Liam was dragged down the aisle of his own wedding reception, sobbing and begging for a lawyer, Lorenzo turned his back on the chaos. He looked down at me, his dark eyes softening into something entirely warm and devastatingly handsome. "I promised you a night to remember, Regina," he murmured, gently, tracing my jawline. Did I deliver? I looked at the ruined wedding, the arrested groom, the humiliated sister, and the room full of high society snobs who would be gossiping about my grand entrance for the next decade. Then I looked at the deadly, gorgeous Mafia boss, who had treated my full, curvy body like it was the most precious treasure on earth. "You delivered," I whispered, wrapping my arms around Lorenzo's neck. Around us, federal agents moved through the ballroom, cameras flashed, and my family shouted as their perfect wedding collapsed in front of everyone. Lorenzo did not look away from me. He simply pulled me closer, calm and untouchable, as if the chaos around us had always been part of his plan. Then he kissed me in the middle of it all. Not to prove a point to them, but to make one thing clear to me. I was no longer the woman they could embarrass, betray, or leave behind. I was standing beside Lorenzo Moretti now, and that changed everything. We did not stay for cake. We walked out of the castle hand in hand, leaving Liam, Chloe, and the rest of my family to face the damage they had caused. The armored Maybach waited outside. Lorenzo opened the door, and I stepped in without looking back. My past ended at that wedding. My new life began beside the most dangerous man in New York. Did Hazel's revenge shock you, or was Lorenzo's wedding gift the best twist of the story? If you enjoyed this Mafia romance, like, share, subscribe, and tell me what you would have done in Hazel's place.